Hi, welcome to week 10 of our course. Today we're going to look at the business case for corporate social responsibility and the concept and role of stakeholder salience. Our outline will be to talk about what is the business case for CSR. We're going to look briefly at a short case study of the Fair Trade label. Then we're going to talk a little bit about research on CSR, and particularly how to measure the extent of responsible activities and see what evidence we have for the business case. So we're going to put this idea to the test and confront it with some research findings. So if we look at the research on CSR, we're talking about a very mixed and diverse field. It's a topic that's related to business ethics, to corporate governance, but also fields like strategy and strategic management, marketing, industrial relations, international business, and more. A lot of research provides moral, ethical, and normative arguments for why firms should adopt CSR. And another strand of research investigates empirically the business case for a strategic adoption of CSR. So a lot of the research that you might come across asks questions like, how does CSR actually influence economic outcomes? And more broadly, what factors explain which firms adopt which kind of CSR measures? So if we look at the business case, is there a kind of business reasons for corporations to behave ethically and be responsible? This falls into the category of an instrumental motivation. There may be sort of relational commitments that companies have, but it's not really a moral argument. So here CSR is something seen as voluntary. It's something based on the decisions of business, not coming as a response to regulation, as we talked a bit about last week. And it's the idea of trying to find a competitive advantage based on CSR, because being responsible would meet the needs of stakeholders, that it's a way essentially for companies to differentiate their brand, their company, or their product, to give it a kind of differentiation in the market. So you might imagine a product being, more green and energy efficient than another one, or a employer having a good brand as a good employer, a good place to work, which better meets the needs of employees as stakeholders, and therefore would give a kind of competitive advantage. Now the other side of that, we also talked a bit last week, is the idea of CSR as a kind of insurance, and that by being responsible and looking into social and environmental aspects of the business, it may limit business risks related, for example, to climate change, social unrest, and so forth. So by being good, at least in the theory, you might limit the case that your company is exposed to or engaged in irresponsible behavior, and therefore doing good things will reduce the likelihood of reputational damage, also in the case that there's actual wrongdoing takes place. So this inspired a lot of research really about the influence of CSR on performance. And there's basically four main ways in which CSR might influence performance. So these are kind of mechanisms or channels of influence. So one could be simply that CSR positively influences the demand for your products. For example, green products may have more customers, and or customers may be willing to pay more because the value of responsible products is greater. The second point is that CSR may make the firm's cost structure more efficient relative to demand. So simply, for example, responsibility toward employees may make the employees happier, more engaged. You may reduce staff turnover, reduce reduce people calling in sick. You may have better and more reliable suppliers. So you're basically making your operation more efficient. If we take an environmental example, it may simply be the case that installing green light bulbs, saves energy over time and may reduce costs. A third channel may be that CSR allows a longer lived usage of assets. So it may be that you be able to enhance innovation or increase the value of investment in your brands and reputation. So by being a kind of responsible company, it may increase your longevity of symbolic assets. And finally, CSR may reduce the risk profile of the firm by basically making it, protecting it from certain kind of market movements and specified forms of risk. So, for example, if you have very good environmental protection issues, you may be, less likely to be exposed to lawsuits or to be exposed to problems of climate change. So how is it then that these effects on performance take place? One way is basically direct effects. So you see in figure 1, you have the firm's strategy affects its performance, and stakeholder relationships also affect performance. But a lot of understanding of CSR has slightly different imagery. You can imagine the firm's strategy affecting performance, and that relationship is moderated by stakeholder relationships, right? So there's a more kind of certain strategies will work better or will work less well in the context of good stakeholder relationships. A slightly different way to think about it is that stakeholder relationships themselves influence the strategic decisions of firms, which then influence performance in figure 2, which can be described as a kind of intrinsic stakeholder commitment model. That strategy sort of flows out of the relationships that the firms have with its stakeholders. So when you kind of get down to the details of it, the relationships, how CSR and stakeholder relations affect performance can be quite multifaceted, can be direct, can be sort of indirect, and can be moderated types of effects. A lesser talked about thing are the potential trade-offs in performance. So we can think, roughly speaking, of CSR having a positive influence on performance because it creates or enhances the use of relational assets with stakeholders, like their trust, commitment, loyalty, goodwill, things that, as we said in the other demand, basically will increase demand or inputs of those stakeholders to the firm. But there's some sense in which CSR might involve costs for firms. A responsibility oftentimes doesn't come for free. Improving environmental standards may cost large out-of-pocket investments. Having higher social standards may raise the cost of labor, etc. So there can be something like a positive influence in CSR, but an empirical question about, how costly are those initiatives? Now, what about irresponsible behavior in the case of doing harm to stakeholders? Again, if corporations behave irresponsibly, it may damage financial performance by depleting trust, goodwill, and other kinds of relational aspects with stakeholders. However, on the other hand, being irresponsible may lower some out-of-pocket costs. So moving production overseas to a country with very cheap labor, very low environmental standards may save money on CSR expenditures, basically by creating externalities, that companies are able to externalize the cost of pollution or the cost of poor labor standards on society. Unfortunately, this may also enhance their company performance. So when we think of CSR and its performance effects, we also want to think in a more complex way that there can be positive effects, but also perhaps trade-offs of countervailing negative effects. So in some sense, this it becomes a more complex analysis. So a lot of discussion has taken place. How effective is a kind of market for virtue? And a basic answer, which I think is a fairly reasonable one, is to say that there does seem to exist something like a market incentive to be responsible or a business case for CSR activities, but oftentimes this strategy is limited. It's a fairly niche strategy. It works for some firms some of the time. For example, particular firms that want to avoid being targeted by activists. Nike was a big case. H&M, also McDonald's. People love to hate McDonald's, and McDonald's has then responded to this by doing a lot of new kinds of activities to at least try to present themselves as being more healthy, more environmentally responsible, and so forth. So, avoiding this kind of negative publicity is an important consideration. Other firms use CSR to differentiate their products from competitors like Ben & Jerry's, Patagonia, where they're basically trying to be more ethical or more green or more social than their competitors. But most of the time, for most firms, the value of reputation among stakeholders has too small of a direct impact to clearly, create a business case. And David Fogel, who we're going to read in the next week, argues that the myriad of factors that affect corporate earnings, CSR remains for most firms most of the time of marginal importance. Okay. So the idea here is basically CSR is something that, it's a kind of niche or kind of special strategy that some firms may adopt. So let's turn now to one kind of example, and this example is not really the CSR activities of a particular firm, but we were talking in the last weeks about CSR as a kind of system of private governance, and we were talking about multi-stakeholder initiatives in CSR. So I'd like to talk a bit about fair trade, which is a labeling scheme. Okay, and I'm sure most of you have come across fair trade. It's quite prevalent in coffee, or maybe when you buy chocolate and a few other products. And essentially, it's not an ecological label. It's not a labor standards thing, but it's basically a label that tries to assure fair minimum prices to producers. So it's something oriented to, for basically like coffee farmers or farmers of cocoa beans. And it's really a standard about the kind of commodity and the price paid to the producers for that commodity. Now, fair trade's a fairly well-developed standard, and it's good in that it's backed, for example, by a system of external audits, where coffee that's labeled fair trade, there will be a process of certification, there's preparation, there's some open meeting, there's a review of documents, there'll be cross-checking of that information, focus group discussions, visiting physical sites, and then a kind of feedback on strengths, weaknesses, and deviations from fair trade standards. And all that goes into the decision to certify a particular commodity as fair trade or not. So fair trade is a relatively young initiative, and it really kind of took off in the kind of early to mid 2000s and has become a quite important point of reference. Now, what does it really do? Again, this is looking at the price of coffee during a time of kind of volatile ups and downs, in which we see that the price of coffee may be influenced a lot by weather, such as different kinds of bad weather, which decreases the supply of coffee and raises the price. And then you have periods of a oversupply of coffee where there's sort of too much coffee on the market. And this is basically, if you see this blue line in the middle, the idea that there'll be a kind of minimum price for fair trade coffee. So even if there's a kind of oversupply, you'll prevent that farmers, for example, will sell their coffee at lower and lower prices and make a kind of negative cycle of ruinous competition. So fair trade, again, it's not exactly a ecological standard, it's not bio, it's not exactly a labor standard in the sense of the farmers, the workers on the farms, but it's basically a kind of standard that engages about the price of commodities, which should support good, decent living conditions for farmers and hopefully feed on to other things like better environmental standards or labor standards. So what does research say about fair trade? Well, again, the case of coffee is the kind of product with the largest share of fair trade, but even if it seems very ubiquitous on the campus of the FU Berlin, fair trade's a very kind of small percentage of the market share of coffee overall. And fair trade coffee is a bit expensive. There's a higher price premium, and this, on one hand lessens consumer demand for that, but fair trade on the other hand has a high credibility. People feel good buying it, and it may increase consumer demand. Now, it seems that most coffee drinkers, though, are what you would call low involvement consumers, so they're basically not so interested in where their coffee comes from. This is a fairly small share of the market. So in terms of fair trade becoming the kind of general standard for all coffee, it seems unlikely that the market by itself will provide this. Okay. So when we study the business case more generally, how does CSR, influence performance? And again, going back to stakeholder theory, suggests the need for companies to have legitimacy in the eyes of customers, employees, and different stakeholders. And CSR may influence their reputation and the development of assets with stakeholders. And again, the kind of conventional view is that doing good, having strengths in CSR, is positive for performance, and having weaknesses or concerns should have a negative effect on performance. And this leads to the standard hypothesis that the more CSR you have, the better will be your financial performance. And now this kind of simple hypothesis doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't seem to be a kind of direct linear relationship. There's better evidence for a kind of inverted U type of relationship where doing more good improves your performance up to a certain point where the cost of doing more good would increase and the kind of additional reputation you might get from those costs may get less. So there's something like a declining returns that could be important. Now, evaluating the business case for CSR and the impact of responsibility on performance is quite difficult for one main reason. Measuring CSR is quite difficult. We talked last week about the idea that CSR is a social construction, and what responsibility really means is quite relative to the expectations of different stakeholders. And the legitimacy of those expectations is often contested, which means different stakeholders, different groups of managers may not agree. So how do we set a kind of benchmark to actually measure how responsible are corporations? Well, we could try to reference agreed standards that are shared by different stakeholders. So try to make a kind of external point of reference. We may try to look just more comparing relative differences between firms. But a more serious issue is maybe the idea of inputs versus outcomes. A lot of times what we measure of CSR are the adoption of policies that a company will communicate. Yes, we have a policy for diversity and inclusion. Yes, we're doing things, a policy for reducing carbon emissions. We can look a little bit more in detail. Is there really a process in place for implementing this? But both of those kind of input-based measures are different than objective measures of outcomes. For example, do carbon emissions, really decline? How many women actually are on the board of directors, if we're talking about gender diversity? So there's a kind of tension or different approaches to measuring CSR focused more on policies and processes as inputs, or versus kind of objective measures of outcomes such as carbon emissions. Now I would say, for example, carbon emissions, it's also not just simply the total number of carbon emissions, but you might think of carbon emissions per product or per household that uses a product or per dollars of sales, right? So there's different ways you could think of the level of carbon emissions relative to the size of the company, which would be important if you were trying to compare and give a kind of benchmark for CSR. Okay. So there's no sort of more problems with measures is that there's no standard form of disclosure about social and environmental performance. So we don't have such well-developed and widespread ways of measuring and reporting. There's not much in the way of audit or monitoring of the quality of CSR reporting, so companies may tend to self-report. And again, in the case of financial reporting, we have all these like gatekeepers there who monitor the quality of financial statements, and we said even then they don't do good enough of a job. But in the area of CSR, there's really not so much there in the way of audit or monitoring, although there's some exceptions we can talk about. So this lack of a clear reporting framework is not simply an academic attitude issue, but it also creates a problem for investors or other stakeholders who have trouble to evaluate or really compare how responsible different companies are with each other. So slowly over time, there's some increasing efforts to coordinate and legitimate CSR as a social practice and to develop a more kind of common, transparent system of measuring these types of activities. So if we look at one of the very early kinds of data to measure CSR activities was developed in the United States, the so-called KLD dataset. And if you look at its components, it looked at 5 stakeholder dimensions, so the relationship of the firm to community, diversity, environment, employees, and things like product safety. And along each dimensions, the KLD would count a number of strengths and concerns reported to each dimension. And basically these different dimensions and weightings give you something like a CSR score. Now, an interesting feature of KLD is that it was always from the beginning very explicit about irresponsible behavior, which it expresses in this category of concerns as a concern over environmental damage or concern over discrimination. It doesn't mean that companies actually do harm, but it gives some kind of indicator of this. And now an interesting finding of my early research on this is that many companies do harm, so they have high levels of concerns, but they often simultaneously try to balance this harm by doing good toward those same stakeholders and developing some kind of strength profile. So now I'd like to talk about 2 problems related to the measurement of CSR and that I think really influence studies trying to link CSR and performance. The first problem is how do studies relate responsibility with irresponsibility. Now, most studies only measure the strength of CSR, or they often capture something like a net CSR, where they take the number of strengths or good things that the company does and simply sort of subtract the number of incidents of irresponsible behavior. Now, what's wrong with this? It simply assumes that strengths or doing good cancel out concerns or doing bad. It affirms that does both good and bad things is actually then equivalent to a company that does neither CSR nor does any irresponsible actions. Now, this is quite a problem because this kind of a negative correlation exists between CSR and irresponsible behavior for some topics like diversity, but for most other aspects of CSR are actually positively correlated with each other. So companies do a lot of good and bad at the same time. And it also assumes that in terms of performance, that CSR is always good, and that CSIR, or irresponsible actions, are always bad performance. In fact, the cost savings of being irresponsible may outweigh the loss of building relational assets for being good. So the relationship between good behavior and bad behavior is actually quite complex, and I think not adequately captured in existing studies. So if we look here again in terms of good behavior in blue and bad behavior in red, we see, for example, US companies have done more and more policies related to diversity over time, and the amount of bad behavior has been relatively stable or declined. But we see in other areas a kind of difference that, for example, in the area of environment, here Umwelt, that the number of problems or concerns has sort of been increasing over time, but more and more companies are doing things simultaneously to address these concerns, so that the level of behavior is about quite similar in both areas, whereas we see that in terms of product safety, that the number of concerns or irresponsible actions is increasing, not much change in CSR, and in the area of employee rights, Arbeitnehmerrechte, here we see again a kind of strong correlation between the two, with more bad behaviors increasing over time. So again, these are just presenting the same thing in terms of overall correlation, and we see for most topics there's actually a positive correlation. So there's some kind of complex interaction between good behavior and bad behavior that we need to understand a lot more. The second problem concerns CSR across different stakeholder domains. When we measure CSR, we're measuring performance across multiple different social issues. This assumes also that different aspects of CSR are equivalent, that being green is just as good for you as being, say, a good employer, and that these things would have the same sort of size of effect on your financial performance. In fact, CSR has rather distinct dimensions. They relate to different stakeholder groups, and the salience of these different groups may be different for different firms. So many qualitative studies of CSR says, well, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, that the kind of CSR you do or the effects your CSR will have on business performance may be different for different kinds of firms. So again, putting all of these into one mix may be misleading. Now, what do actual studies of CSR do? And here we looked over about 20 years, to look at how people actually have used the KLD data set. Did they develop a look at CSR as a kind of single dimension or in a single area, or tried to measure different areas separately. And then we looked at the number of studies, how they treated the concerns or the irresponsible actions, whether they were ignored or subtracted, whether they were also studied as a separate dimension. So again, about 43% of the studies have done a very kind of like unidimensional view of strengths, no attention to weaknesses, or just looking at a net effects. Some studies, about a quarter look at multiple domains, about a quarter look at CSR and CSIR separately, but only 4 studies have actually ever used the KLD dataset, the most frequently used data, with 56 studies over this period. Only 4 of them really looked at quite complex way at multiple domains of strengths and viewing CSIR as a separate dimension. So just to see how this looks in practice, as some work that I did, we looked here at, for example, strengths. So here we're looking at companies they have pure CSR, which means they have strengths and no weaknesses in the same areas, and that this kind of pure doing good in the areas of diversity and employee relations to employees seem to be associated with having high average market to book value or return on assets. An example of this would be like Cisco, which is a company that has quite strong relations to employees in terms of a very cohesive corporate culture, a kind of typical IT firm where people are very committed to the firm, and they use very heavy kind of stock options and other kinds of incentives to include employees in the financial success for the firm. Now, what about, however, purely bad companies? And here, this table is showing that companies that are brown companies, those are not green ones, and companies that also have poor product safety or poor relations to employees also perform quite a bit above average. So again, here, being a very bad firm can lead to high success. So what's a kind of example of this? This would be, for example, General Motors, who has had a very poor environmental track record and a lot of product safety standards, but at that time in the 1990s was performing kind of above average, basically saving on costs. So being good can be good for you, being bad can be good for you. And the answer I want to propose to you for this class is that the success or effect of CSR initiatives depends a lot on the kind of stakeholder. So we need to turn back and go more into depth in terms of stakeholder theory. Stakeholder theory comes from Ed Friedman's stakeholder approach, which was about identifying and classifying who's a relevant stakeholder for the company, stakeholders that companies may address voluntarily or involuntarily, a stakeholder being any group or individual who can affect or is affected by the achievement of an organization's objective. So a stakeholder can be a person, it can be a group, it can be something like a neighborhood or community, it can be another organization, or it can be the environment, which of course is not is a kind of external environment of the firm, which is impacted. So we want to go a little bit further into the depth of stakeholder theory and look at the idea of stakeholder salience. And the article from Mitchell et al. That we're looking at today argues that stakeholders salience has different dimensions: legitimacy, power, and urgency. So legitimacy relates to the perceived validity or appropriate of a stakeholder's claim. So the stakeholder, it's sort of accepted as appropriate that a stakeholder would make a claim on a corporation. Legitimacy is different, however, from power, which is the perceived ability of a stakeholder to influence organizational action. Power may be coercive, it may be utilitarian or normative, but it's related to the kind of dependency involved in the relationship between the stakeholder and the firm. So urgency is a final dimension, which is the perceived necessity for stakeholder actions to require immediate action. So it's capturing the idea of time sensitivity and the degree in which a delay by management in attending to the claim is unacceptable. So it's kind of how critical and important the claim is. And the theory of stakeholder salience says that these are separate dimensions, and the most salient stakeholders are the ones that have legitimacy, urgency, and power. But many kinds of stakeholders may only have one or two of these different dimensions. So that, again, this is a kind of system in which we could try to classify the relative salience of different stakeholder groups. So if we look in detail, basically from these three dimensions, we get a quite complex typology of different kinds of stakeholders. Right? A latent stakeholder is one that has just one of these attributes. So it has generally a low salience. An expectant stakeholder may have two attributes, may have a kind of moderate degree of salience, and a definitive stakeholder is the one with three attributes and has the highest level of salience. Okay, so this is the first layer in which we have sort of, three different levels, and only a certain stakeholders will have this, all three of these dimensions present. Okay, so here again, the latent stakeholders have one dimension, right? Who may be demanding, but for example, not legitimate, or may have power, but not much urgency. The expectant stakeholders are here with these two dimensions, and finally the definitive stakeholder with all three. Now, is another way to look at this. Again, level 3, 2, and 1, having three or the different combinations of two attributes or the different single dimensions. And what we'll try to do is to also say that the salience of stakeholders may evolve over time. So we may have a kind of dormant stakeholder, right, which is basically, sorry, let's go backwards. So this is the dimension of power here, right? So the dormant stakeholder may have some kind of power and may, for example, become more urgent over time and achieve may achieve legitimacy, and then their claims may become more urgent, time urgent over time. So we can just imagine a kind of pathway in which salience changes over time, or we could see a stakeholder that's very urgent and demanding, but then gains legitimacy and power. We could also imagine a definitive stakeholder, for example, losing legitimacy, for example, becomes dangerous, or so forth. So that's just to say we could imagine different ways in which these relations evolve over time. So a dormant stakeholder, one with power but nothing else, is probably have little or no interaction with the firm. What can an example be? For example, an employee who's been fired, who may want to get revenge on the firm, speaking out, talking on the radio, a kind of upset, angry stakeholder who has power, but is not really seen as legitimate or urgent. Discretionary stakeholder is one who's legitimate, but no power and no real urgency. So basically, there's not much pressure coming from the stakeholder on management. The company may voluntarily do things. Beneficiary might be a kind of charity, like take a taxi program, something like donations or volunteer efforts for schools. A demanding stakeholder is one that's sort of urgent, but not very much legitimacy or power. This kind of stakeholders demanding it is kind of like annoying, like a mosquito buzzing in the ears of managers. For example, imagine that every day outside of your company, there's a small groups of demonstrators out there protesting, but who don't really have much power and don't get much attention in the media. Their legitimacy is low. Again, these kind of stakeholders, you're not going to have too much interaction. More interesting are these like double combinations, like a dominant stakeholder that's legitimate and has power, demands some respective attention, has a kind of moderate level of salience, may make direct, for example, legal claims against the companies, and most of kind of typical stakeholder groups we think of fall into this category, like shareholders, creditors, employees, governments. And what about a situation, a stakeholder that's powerful and urgent, but not really legitimate? This kind of stakeholder would be kind of dangerous to management, would be able to coerce, maybe take violent or illegal actions against the company. So you need to spot them and protect. This could be, for example, when employees engage in sabotage, there's radical environmentalists or terrorists, industrial spying, so kind of stakeholders that are not generally recognized in society, but could be quite powerful and could make urgent claims on the company. And what about a legitimate and urgent stakeholder, but one with low power? And again, this kind of stakeholder is quite dependent upon others, like managers or other stakeholders, for goodwill. We could think of citizens, for example, or stakeholders like animals or the environment. When we talk about the protection of animals, the animals themselves can't go to pressure companies, but of course we might see animal rights as being very legitimate, and it may be very urgent in the case of, for example, an environmental disaster. Definitive stakeholders are kind of rare. It's mostly a kind of a dominant stakeholder where that becomes very urgent, as a kind of urgent issue. And for example, when shareholders engage in high levels of activism because they felt their legitimate interests were not served, this could trigger a kind of more urgent action, and the stakeholder becomes from a kind of dominant one to a more definitive one. So what to remember for today: the justifications for the business case, some of the problems and mixed results of research on how CSR influences performance, and a kind of way forward to thinking about these issues that looks at the concept of stakeholder salience. So we'll be looking at more about all of these issues in relation to the environment and in relation to labor rights in the next sessions. So thank you very much.